Hey, what's up guys? Sir Emanon here, and welcome to a brand new series on the channel today that I'm going to be debuting called Side Strats for January 2021. Now, this is going to be my own personal take and spin on analyzing various defensive cards in the format, how they pertain to the metagame, as well as how maybe you guys at home can utilize them across various different matchups. So this is pretty exciting, and it's something in the works that I've been considering doing as far as just having an analytical series on my channel for quite some time, and I'm very excited to sort of finally present this to you guys. And this pilot episode is going to be focusing on hand traps. So if you guys do enjoy this sort of style of video or like the way that it's presented, definitely go ahead and leave feedback, comments, and suggestions as per usual. And maybe I'll do more of these for various different card types or other things in this format or maybe other formats down the line. And before we get started, I do want to go ahead and shout out the two YouTubers who sort of have provided the foundational inspiration for the ideas and concepts in this particular video today. So the first is going to be MSC.TV. A lot of you guys are definitely familiar with his content. He is a competitively oriented and information-based channel, of course. And his counter guides are really cool to me, and I do enjoy watching that content. So I've kind of made my own spin in it, and it'll be largely based on kind of his own design. But I do want to give credit, of course, where it is due. So definitely go ahead and give his channel a look if you haven't already. And the second channel is actually going to be HakunaMyData, which is a smaller channel, but he is very much focused on the quantitative analysis side of things, which is actually not really seen that much in YugiTubing, but he does a fantastic job of putting the data from yugioh.com, which is a site that I'll be using as well, to kind of put things into very visually pleasing graphical form. So if you like either of those kind of concepts or ideas, definitely go ahead and check out their channels. I'll link them in the description below as usual. But without further ado, guys, let's go ahead and get started. Alright guys, so what you're looking at here is actually a table that I compiled listing all of the data regarding the frequency as well as the win percentages of all these various different hand traps, and there's actually going to be even more on the next screen in just a second. But this is all taken from yugioh.com, which is, if you guys are unfamiliar, a website that essentially synthesizes all of DB's data and compiles them into their own tables, not too dissimilar to these ones. Now, they actually break these down into various categories, the first of which is the format as a totality, and the second of which is going to be the most recent 7 days, being this week, of course. So I actually went ahead and kind of went through both of these and looked at specifically just the hand traps, because that's what we're focusing on in today's video. And we're going to be just looking at their win rates and how they stack up, of course. And I actually went ahead and recalculated the win percentages because yugioh only actually displays the percentages rounded to the nearest whole percent. So I wanted to have a couple of significant figures behind it, which is what I went ahead and did right here. Now, the values in green are going to be above 52%, whereas the ones in red are going to be beneath 50%. And of course, there's a couple of different caveats to consider here. First is the fact that Dueling Book as an entire platform is being considered here. So that means that you're going to be running into the meta decks, the rogue decks, but also just completely casual players who might be playing rated, which is totally fine if you're looking at it from an on-balance sort of perspective, and that's totally okay for statistics. But just keep that in mind when it comes to just the way that these hand traps might stack up. Just because a hand trap might have a good win percentage because it might be applicable against various decks that might not be as represented, doesn't mean that it'll be good when you run into a tournament where people are aiming to play their best, right? And then the second caveat is the fact that, of course, you're going to need far more than a win percentage of 50 or even 60% if you want to do well at one of these tournaments. And again, that's not representative in terms of just kind of an on-balance sort of point of view. But for all intents and purposes, when looking at just statistics, I think this is totally fine. Now, the thing you might be curious about is the right two most columns that display sort of the rank and how these hand traps compare to one another. And that is definitely an interesting thing to look at. So the values that are being displayed being, just 1 through 6 or 1 through 9 in the case of the right column, which they're giving me actually 10 hand traps in total. So those numbers will continue on to the next screen. But those are basically going to be what the frequency rankings are for this current format and specifically for this week. That's going to be what the numbers are displaying. But the numbers in parentheses are going to be how those ranks compare to if you looked at the format from the left side being December 15th to the present. So if you look at Droll and Lockbird, for example, it is currently, as of the most recent 7 days, the third most played hand trap of all the ones listed. However, if you look at the entire format from December 15th onwards, it's actually the sixth most because plus 3, right? So it's interesting to see rather that this hand trap in particular actually moved up. So let's talk about some of these trends real fast. So Droll, I guess, is the first one to talk about since we're already on that topic. With the prevalence of Drytron, especially in the last couple of weeks here, it's no surprise that this card is being played a lot more. This card and this it has just been kind of seen as a very good catch-all against that deck because it's one of the only ones that can really just outright stop their turn. And at the beginning of the format, I think that Drytron was being a bit less played because it was right at the tail end of the most recent LCS at the time of recording this video, which means that, of course, players were still experimenting with it. People didn't really fully optimize the Drytron deck or the combos or any of that stuff. So that is kind of the reason why Droll wasn't as popular before. But now, with it being played more, it has also gone up in win percentage, as you can see on the win column. So that is kind of the explanation for that. Something interesting as well, the other thing to kind of notably point out is infinite impermanence. So you'll notice that it has a very poor win percentage compared to what you might expect. And the funny thing is actually is that this is a card that I've actually been tracking for quite some time. We'll also get into kind of the overall ranks and how they stack up when we look at the hand traps individually in comparison to just the entirety of yugioh's entire data pool. But Imperm has gone from the 5th most played card overall, not just hand trap, to I believe it is barely still remaining in the top 25. So this card has continued to decline in popularity as players have figured out that this card just really hasn't stacked up that well. And we'll talk about that a bit more when we get into the hand traps more specifically again individually. But you can see the win rate is kind of reflective of the fact that the popularity is declining quite substantially. And then finally, we can look at the next page here, which I'm going to be honest, something weird happened with DD Crow and Effect Variable, which is why I have asterisks on the left side. Because if you notice, the quantity somehow went up from the entire format to just the span of 7 days, which doesn't make any sense. When I did actually kind of a model of this a couple of days ago before recording this video, everything looked fine to where the numbers for DD Crow and Effect Variable were higher in that column than in the this week column. But that is no longer the case for whatever reason, but I just went ahead and took the data anyway because that is what is given to me, so that's what I'm going to be using. So you can see that those hand traps, of course, did not start off on the best note. And Valor actually is, I believe, the card overall currently in this week that has the 3rd lowest win rate. So that is something that is pretty interesting to think about. But DD Crow actually has gone up a fair bit in terms of win percentage, and even though its ranking has only gone from 9th out of these hand traps to 8th, it is actually right up there with the other hand traps. You can see it's just 0.2 below Lancea, so not too bad overall, and it's something that I'm pretty interested to cover as we'll get into it a bit more later. And I guess the last thing to maybe think about is Nibiru. Nibiru has also kind of fallen down a bit in popularity, making it now to the 2nd page in terms of this particular video. But obviously, it is a card that has seen a lot of play towards the early stages of the format, coming out of the very predominantly combo-centric format, being the September 2021. So it's pretty interesting to see all these dynamic changes, and I think it'll be more interesting to kind of just continue to track them because hopefully I'll be doing these in more formats to come in the future. Alright, so with the basic overview of the hand traps out of the way, let's go ahead and now discuss the individual cards themselves. And before we delve into that, I do want to sort of talk through a little bit my thought process in terms of how I kind of view evaluating cards from both a bit of a qualitative and somewhat of a quantitative point of view. It's mostly qualitative, but these are 3 basic metrics that I sort of go off of when I'm looking at a card and how useful it is in a given format. So the first is going to be impact, and this can be loosely defined by a card's power and its ability to affect the game state. The second is going to be versatility, which has a couple of different meanings, but basically it entails the amount of situations and the way that a card can be flexible across different matchups or even within one particular matchup, which is something that we'll get into a bit later. And the third is going to be called universality, or we can call it utility, but basically this is the ability for a card to actually play either different roles throughout the stages of the game or just be useful at all times. So this is going to be something that is either good as a top deck or good in your opening 5-card hand. And then something to note here is I did give a bit of a score to each of these cards in each of these categories, but these are very subjective and are largely going to be arbitrary, but they're there kind of just as a very first glance sort of look, right? So don't take these as the be all end all sort of metrics. The more important thing is kind of looking at why these cards are either good, mediocre, or not very good, right? So let's go ahead and now move on into our first particular card. So surprise, surprise, the first card we're looking at here is Ash. And I actually have on the right side of the screen here the overall yugioh scope rank. So not only is Ash the most played hand trap of the bunch, but it's the most played card in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! So that should come as a surprise to just about nobody. But yeah, you can see the metrics that I have over there on the right side as well. Again, these numbers are largely meaningless in terms of just overall evaluating the cards, but it's nice to kind of just have a visual if you want to look at it. You can obviously feel free to agree or disagree with the specifics or like the nitty gritty there, but the real important thing is going to be the table. So this is very reminiscent of, again, MSC.TV's approach to the counter guides. So again, big shouts to him. Definitely deserves all the credit for coming up with the idea to begin with. However, I kind of broke it down a little bit differently. So the green sort of cells are going to be the areas in which I think the card is ideal or very strong to use. The yellow situations are going to be times where you can choose to use your hand trap at these moments. However, I think there's usually generally better moments to go ahead and do so, which are going to be, of course, the green ones. However, there are situations where maybe in simplified game states, it is worthwhile to use your hand trap in this particular manner. And then the red ones are going to be pretty interesting. These are going to be actually countermeasures that the decks that you're trying to be playing against have to either outright stop your hand trap or just be able to play past it and mitigate their effects essentially. So let's go ahead and now start off kind of down the line. So I should also note, by the way, that within each particular cell, from top to bottom, roughly speaking, those are going to be in order of precedence in most cases. Again, it's not going to be strict because that's very much debatable in a lot of these instances, but definitely keep that in mind as well, is that like towards the bottom of, say, like the green cells are going to be the ones that I would be less inclined to use Ash on in this instance, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at Virtual World. This is going to be a pretty interesting one. You can ash all the Virtual World hand effects, but the most important ones are generally going to be Lulu and Lulu, and Lelel. Lili, Gigi, not as much necessarily, although they can come up for sure, especially in simplified game states. And this is a deck where really, in a lot of cases with Ash in general, you have to look at everything in context. So I put in the notes down there that it's best paired with other cards, and this holds true because a single Ash, let's be real, is most of the time not going to stop a VW turn or a Drytron turn, right? So definitely have to kind of look at this in terms of, okay, if you only have Ash for whatever reason, when would be the ideal time to use it? So the VW hand effects are a strong case. Qinglong Graveyard effect is also another good one because, of course, that is going to net them to where they need to be. Of course, it can be a little bit risky if their hand is already good, but if again you only have one interruption, you gotta just pick your poison. Kowloon is a good one that a lot of people might miss because even though it requires a certain amount of gates to be able to actually mill cards, it checks on resolution. So again, you can actually ash this. It's kind of similar to ashing like a Shaddoll Fusion, even if you have no extra deck monsters. Paw Desires, of course, triple tactics to draw, E-Telly, and PSY-Framegear Gamma. I mentioned in the previous sort of topic when we talked about the metrics with universality, that if a card can fulfill multiple roles, such as, for example, I put there re-raising your ceiling, then it is a good case to have a high universality score because of the fact that you can like ash a Gamma that would stop one of your critical plays, so you can maybe have the Gamma eat some of your less critical plays and allow you to play the game a lot more efficiently. So that's like one of the ways that ash is useful in a very different context from just stopping your opponent from playing the game. And then for the yellow stuff, I will just quickly read through those. Stardust Charge draw, Croco Dragon draw, Coral Dragon draw, Xiaofeng to search, Fan to summon, which I don't know if that's come up for a lot of people, but it can. And then Foolish Burial Goods. So Foolish Goods is a good one to kind of talk about a little bit because it kind of illustrates the context behind these yellow sort of entries where you could ash the Foolish Goods, but they're going to be able to usually find another way to send Qinglong to grave anyways, right? So in a lot of cases, it's better to just save it for the Qinglong straight up. So you can kind of see the kind of flow of thought, and you can look over to the invoked column and see Meltdown falls in a similar category, right? So that's kind of like another thing you can think about as well. And then for the contingencies for VW, we have extenders because, like I mentioned, if their hand is good enough, they're just going to be able to probably play past your singular Ash. So that's always a thing to just take into consideration. They can just Gamma negate your Ash if you're not careful with it, and you negate, say, like a Qinglong that was sent off Foolish Goods when they have no monsters. And then Triple Tactics Talent, which is a card that they always play. And then for Drytron, we have Alpha and Zeta, both of their effects in hand or graveyard. They search, of course. Cyber Angel Benton, the culprit of that deck, and the reason why a lot of people are seeing this card maybe on a ban list in the not too distant future. Preparation of Rites, Nova, Cyber Emergency, Eva and Megalith full to ritual summon from the deck. So these are all cases in which you can very, very profitably use Ash. And the thing is, again, is that if they have one of these, they probably have another one, which is why by itself it has a lower impact, and that's why the impact score is lower. But if you have it with other cards, then it could be definitely a good kind of backup. For example, if you go first, you can seal the game with it, alongside your other disruptions, of course. And then for the yellow stuff, we have Delta, Dawn Knight, Fafnir, which kind of falls in line with Foolish Goods or Meltdown, Manju, Petite Angel, which, those are more extenders than anything. So by the time they're being able to normal summon these, they already have their play started. So probably a bit late to Ash there. And then Megalith Ophiel, which, probably would just use it on the full if they play in the Megalith build, but, is an option if you want it. And then for the countermeasures, we have extenders again, similar to VW. You could Ash the Zeta, and they could have the Alpha. You can Ash the Alpha, they could have the Nova. It really just depends on what their hand is looking like. They have Herald of Orange Light as well if they really need to negate your Ash. And they also have Call by the Grave, which is a one-of, but still something to be mindful of. And then finally, Aqua Dolphin, which is a very common side card in this deck that a lot of people need to kind of be respectful of, because for the lower attack value hand traps, they can get eaten alive by just normal summoning, pitch a Drytron, get that Ash or like Droll or whatever out of your hand, and then that will be the end of that. For Eldritch, we have pretty straightforward stuff. We can Ash the Scarlet, we can Ash the Cursed Eldland, or the Red Ice Fusion. These are all pretty decent targets. And then you could also choose Ash Extravagance, but it's in yellow, similarly to why you might not want to Ash Extravagance against Dino, because they have ways to just have more impactful cards that you want to Ash, right? So like they might just have the Red Ice Fusion anyway, and then you're just kind of sad. Insight falls in this particular category as well, which I forgot to mention here on the screen, but Red Ice Insight, you might as well just Ash the Fusion at that point. So there you go. And then for the countermeasures, you have the grind game of Eldritch, where like if you stop like one of their plays, they're not playing to OTK you anyways, so one less resource is not horrible because they're looking to play the control game and trade 1-for-1 anyways, so it's not the worst. Similarly, in line with the back row sort of thing, they're going to try and just use their other defensive cards. And then for Eldritch, Zodiac, Dogmatica, and Invoked, all these 4 columns, they're usually not played by themselves, so really it just depends on what other engines they have, and you'll see this as a recurring theme throughout this entire video. And then for Zoo, we have Barrage, which is great in like simplified game states. It's kind of an iffy one, especially earlier on, but it can be useful definitely later. Avarice, if they're playing Pure, and Paw of Desires as well. These are decent ones to definitely Ash. Tenki is one that I guess is kind of similar to Barrage in the fact that it gets better to Ash this card the later the game goes. But this is not one to really Ash turn 1 because they just punish you with an extra Zoo name, as you can see in the red column. Thoroughblade's another one, but it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to Ash Thoroughblade a lot of the time. Unless, again, it's like maybe their only other card in hand and like you're already going to win the game. Fair enough. But Zodiac Combo is another option if they're playing Pure, just to prevent the recycling of resources, which is decent as well. And the countermeasures, again, is that like they typically tend to open multiple zoos if they're playing Pure, and even if not, they have their other engines as well, which is the other countermeasure. And then for Dogmatica, we have Nadir Servant, their power play, Ecclesia, which is always strong, Titaniclad, which is good to Ash if they send it off punishment. If it doesn't make sense to Ash Titaniclad off a Nadir Servant because that means you didn't Ash the Nadir Servant, and I would question that for sure. Definitely Ash the Servant if they open it with it. And then if they play Triple Tactics Talents, that's something you can hit as well if you're comboing it with, like, say, other monster effects. And then the way that they can kind of beat Ash is if you say Ash their Servant and then they hard draw the Ecclesia anyways. That really does happen sometimes, similar to like Invoked. Triple Tactics to draw or to look at your hand, things of that nature. And then again, the other engines. And then for Invoked, you can Ash the Alistair, the Pot of Desires, Triple Tactics Talent, or the Gamma if they happen to use it. Another thing to consider again is Meltdown, but as we mentioned before already, this is not a card that you would typically want to target if it is early on into the game especially. And then similarly to the Dogmatica example, if they hard draw the Invocation when you Ash your Alistair, it can suck, but that is something that does happen. They can also Gamma you because this is a pretty common hand trap in just Invoked in general historically. Call by the Grave is another card to consider, and Triple Tactics as well. So I'll be reading off the duplicates in here less and less as the video goes on because I think you guys get the point by now. And then finally, Prankids is one that I figured that I would maybe cover because it's just really popular on DB ladder. So you can ash obviously any individual Prankid in Grave if they just go normal summon and then make Meow. So that's very, very strong. You can also ash the Dodo if it comes down to it. There might be some game states where you draw this card later, and that could be something that's definitely relevant. You can also like ash Place, but it seems very, very similar to ashing the Field Spell Searcher, being Meltdown and Fafnir not being a very great choice. And then if they play Desires, definitely can use it there. Same with Triple Tactics Talents. I actually did run a very quick little poll last night, and people seem to be split on whether or not they were playing Triple Tactics Talents. So I just am going to put a caveat here. If they play it, then just be mindful of it. You might want to consider it in game one as well, because it seems to be an option. And then the ways they can extend, obviously, is going to be if they open Pandemonium or a way to Fusion Summon. And they could also chain block if they're particularly going second into a board with Place, or Rocket or Dodo, depending on the situation. Call by the Grave and Tactics as well. So that's going to be it for Ash. Alright, so now that you guys got the gist of how this table operates, we can run through these a little bit faster. So Gamma is the next card we want to talk about here, because its YGO scope rank is actually 8, which is very, very high when you consider all the cards in Yu-Gi-Oh, right? It's the 8th most played card on DB right now, with a very, very high win rate. It's the highest one of all these hand traps. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. So for VW, you can choose to negate all the hand effects similar to Ash. These destroy, obviously, or the Gamma destroys, so it's going to be higher impact, of course. If you want to stop them early, that's an approach you can take. You can also stop the VFD itself. Now, this is kind of something to be cautious of, because if they have multiple VFDs, then it's not going to be a good time for you. But that being said, it is an option if they can only somehow end on one. Maybe you combo with another hand trap, which is good. You can also stop the Cloud Castle if they have to rely on it. Most people have figured out or are able to make their first VFD without needing to use Cloud Castle to bring back the first level 9 Synchro, so that's something to think about. But, if it comes down to it, you can choose to, maybe they go for the Shen plus level 3 tuner play with Chuchi and Graveyard, and they're still going for that. That could be something to go for there with the Gamma. You can also negate opposing Gammas if you really need to, just an option. And then for the yellow category, you can really just negate any of their extra deck monsters if you want to, like against an open board. Just really depends on how they go about doing things. But these are all obviously not going to come up as much as the ones in the green. And then ways to sort of counterbalance that. Extenders, again, similar to Ash, it's going to be a little bit harder to do it if you time this well, because, again, just the destruction is very powerful. But they still have ways to possibly play around Gamma if you don't time it the most optimally, so keep that in mind. They can Gamma your Gamma, just like you can Gamma their Gamma. They also have Gossip Shadow, which if you're holding Gamma for later, this is something to think about, where you can really get punished if they use this as sort of an insulation tool. And then Triple Tactics Talents, of course, is another thing. And then for Drytron, we got Alpha and Zeta. These are probably the best ones to stop, especially earlier on into their combo string. Definitely want to cut off their resource looping or cycling, especially when you get access to like Medianist Drytron. Ben 10 you can negate. Union Carrier is a pretty decent one if they are relying and they are very much shoehorning themselves into the carrier play. You can really punish them by just denying the Dawn Knight as well as the body to be able to go with Medianist Drytron. Pretty good stuff. And you can also negate Megalith Full, which is a very, very strong card in the Megalith engine in that deck. You can also choose to stop Eva, Drytron Gamma, which could be useful like later into the game if that comes up. The Dawn Knight and the Manju or Petit Angel, but these are of course going to be less important plays than the previous ones. Again, they can push past things with like extenders. They can negate your Gamma with Herald of Orange Light. They can also stick an early either Vanity's Ruler or Herald of Perfection or Ultimateness. So definitely don't hold the Gamma for too long if you are trying to still get value out of it. Of course, Vanity's Ruler will walk you out of summoning your Gamma and your Driver, so beware of that. For Eldritch, it does nothing. Don't put this card in against that deck. For Zodiac, we have Therablade and Shakanai. Shakanai is an interesting one because it takes the body off the board, so it actually is a lot more relevant than, say, something like Imperm or Valor on it. So that's cool. Therablade is something that came about last format where Gamma was way more popular, especially in the main deck, where people would be able to play around it by just not using Therablade on summon, which you can see there in the red. But that is an option if your opponent happens to be a bit greedier with it. You can also hit Dryden or Zeus. It is kind of weird to use it against Dryden because oftentimes Dryden will be popping monsters unless you're playing maybe Eldritch, and then you have Gamma in here for the Zoo matchup. It seems a little bit wonky. It's going to be hard to find a window where Dryden will be live to pop something that isn't a monster so that your Gamma has the availability to be chained. Going to be tough to do that. And then Zeus, I mean, they can chain Zeus again, so that is not necessarily the greatest, but it does also take the Zeus off the board, which is all right. And it will force it to at least use multiple materials, so that's decent. But I think the better play would just be to try and find ways to prevent Zeus from hitting the board at all. And there's also Barrage, which can extend past whatever ways you have to remove their zoo monster. For Dogmatica, we have Ecclesia and Maximus. These are obviously the power monsters of that engine, not too much to say there. You can also hit Titaniclad, probably wouldn't recommend it. At that point, you might as well just wait for the Ecclesia to hit the board off the Titaniclad and go from there. So that is probably the better bet. And then, of course, these standard countermeasures as well. For the Invoked package, you can negate the Gamma, which is good, and their Gamma, because, again, Invoked is a deck that can definitely play this card. And you can also just sometimes hit Makaba. It's weird. If you're playing a deck like Virtual World and you're activating a monster effect in hand and they Makaba you there, then you can chain Gamma, which is nice. But there's not too many instances where you can opt to use Gamma unless it's against specifically like spells and traps. So it's not a universal window to do it there. So that's why I only have it in the yellow. And then, of course, similar to Ash, if you negate the Alistair and they hard draw Invocation, happens. And Triple Tactic Stone, of course. And then for prank kids, we have, again, similar to Ash, any individual prank kid. They functionally do the same thing as Ash there. And then Dodo is another example. And then the similar countermeasures apply, actually. If she's the same result as Ash, so the way they can play past your Gamma on a prank kid is going to be the same way. So let's go ahead and now move on into the next hand trap. Alright, so next up is Veiler / Imperm, and I lumped these together because right now, honestly, they do about the same thing, and I wouldn't recommend playing either, but let's go ahead and just check it out. So the YG scope rank for Imperm is still 23, and like I mentioned before, it was actually 5 at the beginning of the format, so it's fallen down quite a bit, and then Veiler is all the way down there. That card has a very low win rate. That is not a card that I would highly recommend playing, to be honest. But let's go ahead and look at it. So Virtual World, we have maybe you can hit Cloud Castle if they, again, combo in a very clunky fashion. You can Imperm VFD, but that's not very good because of Chuche. You can hit maybe Vermilion or Coral Dragon or like their Synchros. Like there's just not many good windows. And the reason for that, of course, is that all the VWs activate in hand, so you just can't interact with them. And if they, just have the way to extend even past like your Imperm on Cloud Castle, like there's usually just most of the time ways to be able to bypass it. So that's one of the reasons. Another reason is the Drytron matchup. Apart from Imperm on Vanity's Ruler, there's really just not many good chances to use it. You can use it on Union Carrier. However, a lot of the time, by the time they get to Carrier, they're just trying to cycle throughout more Drytrons to get follow-up for later. And it can be needed to complete their combo. But there's a lot of times where they honestly just have the additional Drytron in the hand, or they're able to just access their plays by additional means. So it's not like Carrier is like essential for the Drytron players to perform all their combos all the time. It's just the way that most people are familiar with doing them to extract the most value. And then Aqua Dolphin is a pretty interesting one because you can negate the Aqua Dolphin so you can actually use your other hand traps more effectively. And I think that's actually probably one of the better ways to use this card as well. But again, it's still not great because that's only a post-side thing and you're not guaranteed to ever draw this with another hand trap. And similarly, the reasoning would be the fact that the Drytrons just don't activate in a way or resolve in a way that Imperm or Veiler deals with them. So you have to just wait until later on. And by that point, you're just letting the Drytron player getting way too many resources, and they're just going to be able to either grind you or just OTK you outright. And they also have 2 different heralds to actually stop you. Purple Light's not as popular anymore as compared to the beginning of the format, but it still is an option. And again, if they are able to kind of just stick something early to deal with your negations, then that is not going to be a very good time. For Eldritch, this again just does nothing. We can move on now. For Zodiac, you can hit like any of these random zoo monsters or Zeus. The thing is that like they can chain Zeus again if you hit the Zeus. They have Ram to protect you from Imperm, and again, they just don't clear the zoo monsters. So like they still have their zoo play, whether it be just holding on to a Trident or making a Zeus, or just even like sitting on a zoo for next turn. You're really just taking a minus with these cards, and they're not going to be accomplishing a whole ton. You can hit like Thoroughblade as well, like I mentioned with Gamma, but again, that's a super low impact, like even lower impact than Gamma at that point. And then we got the Dogmatica stuff. Again, you can hit Ecclesia and Maximus, and those are actually pretty good targets to Imperm or Veiler, because those cards just extract a lot of value by themselves. So it's actually still good against Automatica compared to a lot of these other engines or decks. But that being said, of course, it's supplemented with other stuff. So there are times where maybe you're not able to actually use this as fruitfully as you might want to. Then there's Invoked. I would recommend using Valor on Alistair and then Imperm on Makaba because of the fact that, of course, if they draw the invocation and you like Imperm the Alistair, you might as well just Imperm the Makaba, unless if you're confident they have like more traps to be able to get your Imperm with. But at that point, the Imperm did its job. So if you want to, I think that's something that I would recommend doing, just because you don't really want to lose just them having a live Makaba anyway through your Imperm. But that being said, again, these cards can still easily be played around with for these decks, so it's not really the greatest. And then for Fan Kids, it's really weird because you can only stop them by the time they already get to play, that being Dota or Rocket, which means that you're not really dealing with the fact that they got their engine started. So compared to cards like Ash or Gamma, these cards are going to be a lot less useful there. And again, another thing is that you can actually use the Quick Play Pandemonium in that deck to dodge these cards if you chain it to like Dodo or Rockets. So there's just a lot of things that these decks can do to just either ignore Impermanence entirely or just mitigate their drawbacks. So again, I would just say that they're just not super effective right now. It's not their format. They'll come back later for sure. They were good last format too. It's just that right now I would probably put these aside. So the next hand trap here is one that's pretty hot in the market, and it's actually going to be Ghost Belle and Haunted Mansion. Now for context, this has a YGO scope rank of 20, which is higher than Infinite Impermanence. So that's quite astounding to think about. If you're to tell me that last format, I would have been like, wow, that's crazy. But yeah, this card's really just good right now. It's a grave-centric format. It hits things that are generic, like Call by the Grave, for example, and it's just overall really solid. It can hit a lot of things similar to Ash, like in terms of starters, which you can see right here in the table. But again, because we're in a grave-centric focus, this is a pretty good hand trap to kind of look at. So first for VW, we got Lao effect. This is one of the best ones to stop because, again, this is the way that they get their major push. Now, if they play in such a way, especially turn 1, where they're relying on Lao as a backup plan to play around like Nibiru and such, you might want to consider hitting the Nian or the Gigi, just because stopping them from hitting VFD at all in the first place is paramount. Now, at that point, if their hand is that stacked, then a single Ghost Belle, similar to Ash, is probably not going to be enough to stop their turn. But, Belle and Wawa could really catch players off guard if they're not playing the most optimally. Cloud Castle is another similar case where I think a lot of players are kind of just migrating away from this card in general. But that being said, if this is something that your opponent is relying on as a crutch, you can really punish them. And then the last card is Gamma, which a lot of people probably already know about this, but just as a quick refresher, because the Gamma can summon the driver from the graveyard, you can actually use the Belle in it, so that's cool. Apart from that, you can mid-game, I guess, use it on Shen Shen Revive. It's not the greatest, but it can come up if you really need to deny that and have your other plays resolve, like if you need stuff going into the graveyard. And then you can also stop Constoa Ptolemy 7, which is a card some people play, because it can add from grave to hand. So that's all right. I mean, it's never really going to come up, honestly. Like, you're not really going to Ghost Belle that as opposed to all these other instances, but it's an option. And then the ways to play past this are very similar to Ash. I did add Gossip Shadow to this list because if you are holding it for Lao, they can make Gossip Shadow before they commit to Lao as well. So that is definitely something to not sleep on for sure. And then for the Drytron deck, you can hit all the Drytrons in graveyard, but you can't hit them in hand except for Gamma, because if they activate in hand, this is a ruling to know, they cannot possibly be summoned from graveyard if you're activating them in hand, because their location of activation and where they're going to be summoned from is from the hand. It doesn't make sense, right, to activate in hand and then have it summoned from the graveyard somehow. So because there's not going to ever be a situation where if you activate them in hand, they summon themselves magically from the graveyard, you can't actually use Ghost Belle in those scenarios. So definitely keep that in mind. That being said, again, you can use Ghost Belle in response to Drytron Gamma hand effect, because that includes a subsidiary effect, which reborns a Drytron, right? So that makes sense. You can also use it on Preparation of Rites, because it can add back ritual spells from grave to hand, even if there are none currently in the graveyard, because again, this is another case of it checks on resolution. So this is a case where by the time it resolves, Prep of Rites can somehow find a ritual spell to add back. Maybe you go Prep of Rites Chainlink 1, Twin Twister Chainlink 2, pitch a Meteorous Strytron, target back row, and then you can add the Meteorous back. So that's a reason why you can kind of tell those differentiations apart. Meteor Strytron is another pretty good target for Ghost Belle and Haunted Mansion to hit for both effects in terms of the Ritual Summon as well as the Add Back from Grave. I have an asterisk here, which you can see, because Fafnir, if it's on board, will protect it from being negated while on field, so be very, very cautious of that. And you can also negate the Megalith Full effect to add back if they are playing the Ritual, or sorry, the Megalith build, so that's pretty good. And then you can also negate Natasha one time. I'm not really sure if you would really want to do that, but it's an option if it is needed. You can also hit the Herald of Mirage Lights if they use that to actually float and try and add back resources. By that point, they already have resources to work with, so it's probably a bit too little too late for Ghost Belle to matter, but maybe it could if you have managed to kind of grind them out and they need that float to really get resources back. And notably, Ghost Belle negates activations, which means that you can actually negate this in the damage step. So if like they try and crash it, you can actually use it there too, which is cool. And then similar sort of countermeasures, Extenders, Herald of Orange Light, early Ritual Herald hitting the board. This also loses to Aqua Dolphin, unfortunately, and Call by the Grave. And then for Eldritch, this is a really cool one. So you can negate, of course, the Scarlet Sanguine since it summons from Graveyard. You can negate the Lord Graveyard effect to summon itself, and you can negate Walkero because, of course, that card banishes from Grave. So this is like a nice defensive card as well because obviously it stops your opponent's plays. But again, we talked about universality in terms of just various different ways to fulfill multiple roles, and being able to maybe stop Walkero from trying to hit a Drytron. You can, if you're a Drytron player and you use Ghost Belle, there you go, pretty good application. You can hit the White Destiny if they are playing it, and you can also hit the Red Ice Wyvern if they're on the Dragoon build. Not the most insane play, but it can come up, I guess. And I guess this will actually show up in a couple of other entries here as well for other hand traps. Similar to Ash, the way that you, as the Eldritch player, can kind of play past Belle is just if you have a strong enough hand to just grind past it, plain and simple. For Zodiac, you can actually negate Avarice, which is cool. So that's like another kind of pseudo Ash. We talked about in the notes here where you can negate a lot of things that Ash can also negate with Belle. So that's really, really nice. Of course, Ash overall has more applications, but it's nice to see that Belle can really put its work in as well. And then you can also Ghost Belle the Shockanine, but that's similar to Veiling it, and I would recommend that. You can also hit the Zodiac combo, but that's like a lot more minor than something like Avarice. And this card, pretty similar, again, to Impermanence Veiler. Just doesn't really interact well with Zoo or handle the Zoo monster, and there's other engines to worry about too. So probably really skip out on this in terms of the Zoo cards themselves versus Ghost Belle. For Dogmatica, we have Nibiru Servant, which adds from Grave to hand as well. So definitely make sure to use your Belle on the Nibiru Servant if you have it. You can stop the Schism. So there's a ruling here to kind of just clarify. If they flip Schism and then they use it on activation, like as soon as they flip it face up, and you negate the activation with Ghost Belle, it goes to Grave. But if the Schism's already face up and say like maybe you draw a Ghost Belle later on, and then you negate the effect of Schism, it'll stay face up. So just be mindful of that. App Clone also is something if they like start up with the Nibiru Servant, or like if they have Punishment, which is more likely because again, why would you not negate the Nibiru Servant if you had the chance to? But like maybe if you're playing against like the Trap Shit All deck, and then they use Punishment, and then they send App Clone, and then you can Ghost Belle it. That actually has come up for me before personally, so that's nice to kind of be aware of because it adds from Grave to hand as well. You can also be punished if, again, same example as like Nibiru Servant versus Ash. If they have the Ecclesia, it kind of sucks. But I mean, you do what you got to do in that matchup, right? And then for the Invoke stuff, you can hit the Invocation, either effect of it similar to Meteor and Strytron. And again, it has a corollary where you have Meltdown, where that can protect the on-field effect of Invocation from the activation negation of Ghost Belle. So, very much things to consider and keep in mind. And then for Prank Kids, you can actually stop the Dodo ad from Grave to Hand, which can be a bit of a hindrance if they're relying on the back of the Battle Butler play, which is cool. And then Bow Wow is kind of similar, but a lot of the time stopping the Dodo is just more proactive. And that'll be it for Ghost Belle. So next we'll move on into another Grave-centric hand trap. Next up we got Skullmeister, which is one of my personal favorite hand traps, and is one that is very graveyard adjacent hate to things like Ghost Belle, of course. And oftentimes the two are compared, but they actually have their key differences where this card has a lot of wide coverage, especially towards the later stages of the game, where you can stop things that are going to pretty much appear in the graveyard at all points. Things like Qinglong every single turn, things like Eldritch Traps every single turn. So it's nice to be able to have a way to kind of rely on a card that'll be live at all those different points. But they're very different again, the cards between Meister, Belle, and even DD Crow. So let's go ahead and talk about them. So first we got Virtual World, where you can stop primarily Qinglong, but you can also stop Nian, which is nice. But stopping the critical search is probably what you could be going for a lot of the time. But it's nice to be able to have the flexibility, of course, which is one of the key tenets. You also got Shen Shen to be able to stop the revive effect. Could come up if you, again, want to push other plays across. You got Chuche, which has the graveyard modulation effect in Grave, which definitely can matter if your opponent is relying on like raising their Lili or their Lao Lao, or maybe like lowering something to be able to go for a synchro play. Definitely something to think about, because that can be a way to stop BFU from hitting the board, and you take those chances whenever you can, right? And then we got Coral Dragon if you want to stop your opponent from drawing a card. And then you can also stop the Fan from floating if you ever get to that point. Not often, but can come up. And then for the Drytron deck, you can stop all the Drytron graveyard effects, which is really, really nice. Of course, it's nice to be able to have the ability to permanently remove them if you're playing stuff like DD Crow or Cycle Reader, but this is a nice alternative if you want like a lot of wide coverage. Hitting Benten's also really, really nice. That is arguably should be above the Drytron graveyard effects. Honestly, this card is prime target number 1. And then we got Meteors to add back. Unfortunately, you can't negate the on-field effect like you can with Belle. But again, if they have Fafnir, then that is a moot point regardless. And then you have Eva, which is a fine choice to negate, but by that point, you're letting them already have fairies to banish for cost. So that means that you got them, or they got to a point where they could have multiple searches. So I feel like it's a little bit late at that point. But again, you might top tick later, so could definitely be a good trick to have up your sleeve. Then there is the Dawn Knight, which you can stop. Again, that's not an integral part, kind of similar to hitting Union Carrier with Impermanence. It's okay, but it's not crucial necessarily. Then there's also Natasha, which you can stop once, but they just use it again, so wouldn't recommend. And then there's also the Eldritch matchup, where they have, of course, the Lord Graveyard effect, all the Eldritch Trap effects, and the Cursed Elder Graveyard effect. These are all really, really good Skullmeister hits. And because of Trap's banish for cost, you can actually kind of cut off their grind a little bit, unlike in the Drytron matchup, where they'll just kind of stay there and you have to still deal with them. You can also deal with Red Eyes Wyvern if you want to. Not really sure why you would, but it's an option. Zodiac, the only thing really is you can stop Zodiac combo. I don't think anything else activates in Graveyard that I can think of off the bat than in that particular deck. I guess you could stop Ram destruction, but really not anybody's going for Megaclops anymore. So I don't even think that that's super relevant. I guess you could stop maybe the floating effects if like they just keep the Ram or the Bunny Blast on the field. So maybe I should have put those there. But those are going to be not the most impactful. However, Meister, again, just showing that it is versatile for sure. And then we got Ecclesia, which is going to be represented by Dogmatica. I don't know why I just said Ecclesia. It is 2:30 in the morning, guys. I'm recording this very, very late. But we're going to be here negating possibly Titaniclad or Apclone. These are really, really good choices, especially if they're sending off of like Nadir Servant or Punishment, and you're able to open like a Belle or an Ash. It's nice to be able to stop their like follow-up plays or just ways to get more advantage. It is, again, less effective versus the Servant opens than Punishment comebacks, which is something I mentioned here, simply because if you're letting the Servant resolve, then they already got value, so like Meister at that point doesn't matter as much. Then we have the Invokes deck, where you can stop Invocation in Graveyard, but they'll just be able to use it again next turn, so you gotta be kind of cautious of how you're using this. Maybe you're in a situation where like you don't want them to add Alistair back to hand, so like they won't have any monsters up for Makaba in a simplified game state. Could matter, so definitely keep that in mind. And then finally we got the Prank Kids, again similar to Ash and Gamma in that respect. Not really too much to say there. So next we'll move on to the final Grave-centric hand trap, which is going to be DD Crow. Alright, so the final Grave-centric hand trap here is going to be DD Crow, and this card you can see is rank 74 right now on overall yugioh scope. This is a trend that is upward, and I think it might continue just because it is pretty underrated at the moment, and I think it has a lot of very strong applications where Meister and Belle might leave some minor holes to be covered. So that's pretty cool. So let's go ahead and look at these. So we got Virtual World, where if your opponent, again, is relying heavily on Cloud Castle, you can punish them there, hitting just the target out of Graveyard. You can also hit the Shen Shen if it tries to come back, which is nice if you're in a grind game and just want it gone. That way they have to rely on like Nian to recycle it back and then like summon it again, which is pretty cumbersome to do sometimes. You can also hit the Qinglong, which early on could be very useful if they needed to play. There are cases where they could just get a second one into the graveyard, which is not the best, but there are also other times where they just needed that Qinglong search, so that is pretty nice. And then you can also hit whatever they're trying to summon off of Lao. Now, it doesn't target, so you have to be very savvy of when you use it there. But if you can surmise if they need like a specific level tuner or non-tuner, you can really just hit them where it hurts. Also, if they have just one target, that's neat too. You can also hit the Nian Yan. I'm not sure if you prioritize it over the other cards up here, but it is an option if you want to deny the level 3 tuner. You can also hit the M7 add back, or turn off yugioh's protection or the ability for it to activate its effect. Would that come up? Probably not in like maybe 1,000 games, but you know it's an option there. And then for the Drytron deck, we have Meteonis in Grave, which is huge. We have the Drytrons in Graveyard, which is nice to be able to cut them off from a later access in the game. We have Ben 10, which I'm putting an asterisk here because you got to check the rulings with the head judge to make sure. I think it's mostly agreed upon, but I'm not sure if it's universally agreed upon. But the idea of Drytron tributing a Ben 10 for a cost, and then you chaining DD Crow to that Drytron, hitting the Ben 10 out of graveyard, forces the Ben 10 to leave the activation location where it is meant to be triggered, thus it cannot activate at that point in a new chain. So that is something to definitely be mindful of and consider. Definitely confirm with your judge at whatever event you're playing. I am fairly confident that DB is abiding by this rule at the moment, so that is something that is nice to think about. You can stop the Natasha, which is nice, very nice, because that just means your monsters are not going to be stolen, and that's really, really good. And you can also interfere with ritual summons, which is cool, because of the fact that there are some cases where you can really mess up their play if like they activate Meteonis and like you hit like a Benton engrave. Maybe they didn't search another Benton because they were just relying on that one off the Dawn Knight play, and you can really punish people. So that's nice to kind of think about as just a way to kind of mess with your opponent. You can also stop the full add back because it does target in the Megalith build. Probably just stop a Benton right there. And then you can also hit the Eva if it has been sent for cost from like a Herald of Perfection or Ultimateness. By that point, they probably can just negate the Crow, so it's not great, but I mean, there's an option. Maybe they pitch for like Nightmare Phoenix, who knows. But yeah, that is going to be it. Oh, a way that they can counter, by the way, the hit of Drytrons is if they play Beta. So some people are playing Beta just as another name because it can come up in cases where you open very Drytron heavy. But if they are playing the one-up Beta, then you can go ahead and recycle whatever Drytrons, which is nice. For Eldritch, you can hit Lord Engrave, which is good when it tries to activate. You can also hit the Golden Lands in the main phase or battle phase or stamina phase or whatever, just not the end phase. And you can also use it on Sanguine if they use it to summon Golden Lord already earlier. That way you can just cut off their eventual access to a Golden Land. Like maybe they only start off with a Scarlet, then now they're going to take a lot longer to actually get actual disruption from their Eldritch cycle. You could also hit Red Ice Wyvern, I guess. I don't know. Probably better to hit the Dragoon when they go to target with Wyvern, but I guess you can hit it. But yeah, we can go on to Zodiac. You can actually hit one of the average targets because it has to shuffle back all 5 to draw 2, so that's cool. You can hit the Tiger Mortar target, which is not the greatest. You can also hit the Shakunite target, which is decent sometimes, but it's similar to like Ghost Belle at that point. Again, doesn't actually handle the zoo monsters, so be mindful of that. For Dogmatica, we got Titaniclad, which you can hit before the end phase, similar to the Golden Lands of the Eldritch matchup, which is nice. You can also hit Schism when they target it with Construct, and like if they do the whole Maximus play. And you can also hit various Shaddolls out of your opponent's graveyard if they actually use the Schism and they're on like a very small Shaddol lineup. If they only have one Shaddol and they don't have like enough Darks to make Winda, you can actually just DD Crow the appropriate target, and that could be good sometimes, especially if they like use multiple Schisms or use it multiple times. And we can go ahead and now move on to the Invoked, where this is a pretty weird one. So like, you can hit Alistair when it's in the graveyard if they go for like Almirage or Secure Gardener or the Magistus Link. Those are okay. Those are pretty decent times to hit it. Other times that I would argue are possibly worse are once Invocation's in graveyard, or if you are basically chaining to hit the Alistair when they go to Invocation. I think that one is like probably the worst one, the last one, because they can just try Alistair again next turn. And if you're not able to like capitalize on that, then it can hurt. I guess it could depend on what deck you're playing. If you're able to OTK, then one turn reprieve might just be all you need. As far as the invocation in the grave itself, by that point they already have like Makaba on the field. They could negate it. It's reasonable to assume that there's a point where maybe they just let it go through, which is nice because if that invocation does get banished, then they just have no more recursion. But these are not as surefire of a way to kind of stop the invoked play from popping off, maybe. I guess the way to prevent or to punish the whole hitting the Alistair once it's link summoned before invocation even gets dropped is if they have an Alistair in hand. That's a way, I guess, to get punished, because then they get to summon the invoked monster and they get to recycle the Alistair that you banished with DD Crow. So I guess all of these could probably just be in the yellow category, but it's not bad. And we can now move on into the Pranked deck, where you can hit one of the Dodo targets or Rocket targets or Bow Wow or Washer or Pranks, but you're only hitting one, so it's not the greatest. It still tries to resolve as much as possible, so they're going to try and like add back the one, or they will be going to add back the one for like Dodo or Bow Wow, for example, or summon the one off of Rocket or Washer. So it's kind of mediocre overall, but it's not the worst. Now we're done with the grave-centric hand traps, and now we can move on into more of sort of the side deck hand traps for this format for the most part. Alright, so here is Nibiru, the big rock. It's still a really popular card, and I actually have this organized quite differently. So I have the green being the consistently in Nibiru range, the yellow being in the sometimes Nibiru range, and the red being probably not going to happen, or ways to even just play around Nibiru for these decks. So Virtual World, they are constantly in Nibiru range, but oftentimes if they can only make one VFD, their hand was pretty weak, but you could just make it on the VFD, or drop the Nibiru rather on the first VFD, and that's pretty good. Usually that's best when you pair it with something like an Ash or a Belle, and that's good. If they don't have the follow-up play, then that is good to go. The way that they're going to play past it, of course, if they have Lala with Chuchi up, which they often do because they're grabbing Chuchi a lot, because Lu is often searching Kowloon, so that is something to definitely think about. Also, Gossip Shadow, definitely a very, very strong way to play around Nibiru. If they play 2 VFD, then really sucks. That's the whole point of playing 2 VFD. And that is about it for those countermeasures. Of course, triple tactics notwithstanding. Then for Drytron, similar case. You can chain to the second activation of Medianist Drytron if they're relying on like getting the Herald of Perfection or Ultimateness out. And if they no longer have the machine bodies on the board, that's really, really good. The reason why I'd say to the second one, not the first one, is that oftentimes they can get to Union Carrier under 5 summons, so you can't even use Nibiru yet at that point. But if they do use the Relinquish Anima and the Link Rebo to go and make Carrier that way, then that is likely going to be 5 summons. It's not guaranteed, but it's a possibility. Now, they can also have extenders. It's hard to really distinguish which ones play past Nibiru, but a lot of them do. They could just like hard draw more Drytrons. That way, like if you try and deny the second Medianus to summon out the Herald, they might just tribute from hand instead, and that is sometimes unfortunate. Also, Herald of Orange Light is typically added by the time you can use Nibiru, which makes it a little bit questionable at times. And if they have Benton on field, they actually get to trigger their Benton effect. So that's another way, similar to like if they use it for a tribute summon for Vanity's Ruler, that is a thing as well. And speaking of Vanity's Ruler, if they have on board, you just can't Nibiru at all. So that is something to definitely be considerate of. Eldritch, nope. Zodiac, usually not. They have to be really greedy, but Trident 4 summons, usually the way to go. Dogmatica, not really. Invoked, Makaba 4th summon, or sometimes 3rd summon if they're going for Magistus Link. And then for Prankeds, sometimes they get there. A lot of the times they just opt for 4 summons, but if they try and add back off of Dodo, like if you know that they're going to be about to do, or they're about to actually try and do that, that's when you can hit them with the Nibiru there. They of course have a lot of ways to extend past it if they opened well enough, so Nibiru is not a surefire thing against Prankeds, but if they commit hard into it, they definitely can be punished. So that's going to be it for Nibiru. We're going to now move on into the next hand trap. Alright, so the second to last hand trap here is going to be Artifact Lancea, which continues to be a side deck staple moving from last format into this one, and its scope I would say is slightly more narrow when you compare the two formats, but it is also similar to Nibiru in the sense that you are going to be able to easily tell when you side this in, and it's going to have a pretty high impact in a lot of those cases. So let's start off with Virtual World, one of those matchups actually. So you can go ahead and prevent the Qinglong search. It stops Chuche from either level modulating or actually contributing to enough banished resources to actually enable the Chuche on field to pop. And it also stops Paw of Desires from being able to activate if you do shotgun this card in the draw or standby phase. Now, of course, you can fall prey to PSY-Framegear Gamma, but if you do it in the main phase, they might just start off with Paw Desires, or you might just lose to Triple Tactics Talent anyways. So that might be also something to consider. In some cases, your hands could be good enough to extend past the Lancea, but those are actually relatively few and far between, so Lancea is quite effective there. Additionally, there's some minor applications mid-game. You have, for example, Shen Revive if you want to stop that, as well as various removal tools such as Vermilion, Dragon Mech, and the Yugioh. But overall, you're going to be able to get value off of just stopping their play starters, and that is the primary use for it, of course. Next up is Drytron. We have not too much that can be used here for most of the cases. It was interesting because when this deck was initially making VFD prior to the Link Cross ban, it actually was applicable to stop like the Trish Fusion, but unfortunately right now it only really stops the Eva, and that's usually resolving in your turn because they're pitching it for their Herald negates. So because you can't Lancea on your own turn, it's not going to be very effective there. There's also Natasha, which is relatively useful like mid to late game if you want to stop them from just snatch stealing all your stuff. But by that point, you're probably quite far behind in resources. I wouldn't really board this card into that matchup if that is the sole purpose that you're looking for to try and stop them. Would rather just stop their plays in general. And just Drytron in general does not actually tend to banish a lot, so we can just move on here. Next is Eldritch. Of course, all the traps do banish, which is good, but it's only a one-turn reprieve, and they can just use the traps next turn if you can't actually OTK or set up a board that breaks through their disruption. And oftentimes, if you're trying to board in Lancea against Eldritch, you'll be going second, and you're going to have to contend with back row as well, or whatever other engines, of course, that they're playing. So I wouldn't really side this card in against that matchup. I think, honestly, Skullmeister and DD Crow are just better, and Ghost Belle too. But in terms of actually dealing with the trap floating, Meister allows the traps to actually banish themselves for cost, so they can't just reuse them, whereas this card, just keeps them in there for future use, so it's not going to be the best there. Next is Zodiac. It really doesn't do anything, like, actually, besides, I guess, Zodiac combo, but they can chain it. It's not good. Next up is Dogmatica, where you can prevent Maximus from coming out, which is decent, but I think there's other more effective ways to stop like their Schism play. For example, you can just prevent Ecclesia from searching at all, or Nadir Servants too. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of go about doing this that don't involve specifically Lancea. And if you're looking to stop like the Schism play itself, then they're oftentimes going to Schism you on your own turn rather. And similarly to kind of the logic with Eva in the Drytron matchup, you can't Lancea on your own turn, so the most kind of threatening way that they're going to banish cards is not going to be stopped by Lancea. Next up, we have Invoked, which this card is historically quite good against. Of course, you can chain it to Invocation, therefore they won't be able to actually bash their resources, and it leaves the Invocation kind of stuck in the graveyard because of the fact that Alistair is not going to be banished since they're under Lancea. It also prevents Paw Desires, which is a very common card in that matchup, of course. Now, this is a pretty interesting paradox here as well, because if you do shotgun this card into standby phase to not lose to Tactics, then they might just not open Alistair because there's only 7 copies, and they're probably going to play it with other engines as well. And those engines could be like Dogmatica, which, as we already established, is not the greatest deck in terms of ones that are affected by Lancea. But if you do wait to chain it, then you possibly can lose to Tactics where they can draw their other engine anyway. So it's kind of a weird sort of dynamic going on, so you got to kind of decide if this is actually the best option there. And then finally, there's Prank Kids. This is not the greatest card against Prank Kids in a lot of cases. It stops some things, like if they play Desires, and I guess if Fringe stops Roxy's. Actually, the playing Graveyard effect shouldn't even be on here, because that's, again, going to be used primarily during your turn. So, honestly, it's not a great hand trap against Prank Kids. There's plenty of ways enough to try and stop them anyways. So with that, let's just go ahead and move on into the final hand trap. Alrighty guys, so we have finally made it to the last hand trap of the video, and that's going to be Droll and Lockbird. So I want to thank you guys if you have made it and stuck with me here till the very end. This video took a long time, a lot longer than I even anticipated to actually put together and even to record. This is my second day of recording actually, so very, very much a lot of time went into this, so I do want to thank you very much. And if you have been enjoying, please do leave a like in the video and share it with some friends who might find this useful as well. Would very much appreciate it. But regardless, we're going to go ahead and talk about Droll. This is another pretty high impact hand trap, and it's actually seeing more play than even things like Ghost Belle. You can see with the yugioh scope rank there. And this is once again a byproduct of just Drytron's overall popularity, and this is a card that really just outright stops them if they don't have extremely specific answers. So this is another kind of similar floodgatey type hand trap where it's really, really bad in certain matchups. So it's super targeted in its application, but it's going to be really effective when you do end up actually using it. So first off, let's start with Virtual World. They do have a fair amount of search effects, which is not horrible. They have Qinggong and Lulu, which they're trying to resolve both of in most of their sequences. So if you want to cut off one of them, then that's not the worst thing. However, they're often not reliant necessarily on resolving both if the hand is good enough. And they do have some other miscellaneous sort of drawing effects like Desires in like weaker hands if they have to start with it. And also Triple Tactics Talent if you combine, Droll with maybe other hand traps as well. So this card definitely can have some applications. It's not terrible against Virtual World, but at the end of the day, I think there's other just more effective options in general. Next up, there's going to be Drytron, and this is this is the entire reason why this card is honestly seeing mainstream play at the current moment. So you can stop, of course, their searching after they resolve any of those three Drytrons being Alpha, Zeta, or Delta, Preparation of Rites, Fafnir, Cyber Emergency, Cyber Angel Benten, their normal summons, Imandra Petit Angel, or even like Ophiel. All these cards very, very much contribute to the cause of just searching. So really just any way to stop that train is a very, very good sign. They, of course, do have countermeasures in Orange Lights, Call by the Grave, and especially post-side, they're really citing an Aqua Dolphin to stop this card in particular. But, I mean, if they don't have it or they're not playing it, then this card is going to do a lot of work. Next up is Eldritch. I mean, they have Extravagance, they have Insight, they have Curse Eldland maybe, but overall, it's not really what you want to see. They could really just set 5 and pass, and then you just have a dead card. Then there's Zodiac, which is kind of similar. I guess they have Tanky, they have Desires, they have Therablade, but again, pretty weak in most scenarios. Wouldn't really recommend it. Then there's Dogmatica, which is actually pretty decent, mostly because if you're pairing it with like other engines, then it could be quite strong. Nadir's Servant into Ecclesia is one way you can stop them. That's one window. There's also, the Invoked engine. If those are paired together, then Droll becomes a lot stronger because then there's even more searching happening. So, like I mentioned in those notes there in the red sections for both Dogmatica and Invoked, the other engines that you are seeing these two strategies supplemented with could make Droll either stronger or weaker. So you really have to assess that and see if their deck is really actually reliant on that searching. And then finally, there's Trinkets. There's not a lot of searching here, to be honest. Like, there's Place, which is fine. There's Desires if they play it. Roxy's and Dodo. Dodo is kind of relevant, to be sure. And depending on how they sequence things, it definitely can come up. But it's not really reliable that they are reliant on, starting off with, like, Place, and then they're going to, have to resolve Dodo in that turn as well. So it's definitely a toss-up. It's not the reliable hand trap. And again, there's a lot of plenty other good countermeasures already. So guys, that is going to do it for this entire video. I really do just want to thank you all for watching this video. This has been a massive project to put together, but I am really happy with just the way it has looked visually. If you guys have suggestions, of course, feel free to leave them in the comments. And I would very much like to do this more in the future. But that's going to do it for the video, guys. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy, be sure to leave a like as well as any thoughts or feedback in the comments. Subscribe for more informative and competitive Yu-Gi-Oh content. If you want to, you can follow me on all social media platforms or support me via Patreon and TCG Player. All the links in the description as usual. And until next time, I will catch you in the next video. See you guys.